Hello and welcome. I'm Karthik Sankaran, Senior Research Fellow in Geoeconomics in the Global South Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., that advocates a grand strategy of restraint for the U.S. We believe that a foreign policy that emphasizes military restraint, diplomatic engagement, and cooperation with other nations will serve American interests and values better than policies that prioritize the maintenance of U.S. global dominance through force. Now, in the Global South program, we look at that vast region that goes from Manila to Mexico and at what were once variously called developing countries, non-aligned countries, and so on. In a geopolitical context, this Global South categorization captures those countries that are treated neither as primary strategic adversaries of the U.S. and are not also treated as primary and are not also tied to the U.S. in a formal defense alliance that commits the U.S. to their defense. Now, my own focus within that area is on how geopolitical considerations interact with economic, financial, and trade interactions. And obviously, there's been a lot going on recently on that front. So I'm absolutely delighted to have here a guest who can talk about all these things and more. Paul Blustein, a financial and economic journalist with an absolutely storied career. Paul is a senior associate with the economics program and Scholl chair in international business at Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and Oxford University. He was a Rhodes Scholar who then spent much of his career as a reporter at the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. He has written several authoritative accounts of major crises. In fact, if there's a crisis in the last few decades, Paul's probably been there and written about it. These books include The Chastening about the Asian financial crisis, and a book called And the Money Kept Rolling In about the implosion of Argentina's currency board. Now, these are books I have described as the blood on the tracks and desire of the financial journalism genre because it's an amazing back-to-back performance. He also wrote something called Laid Low on the IMF's role in the Eurozone crisis. He's written about trade more recently. And Paul lives in Kamakura, Japan. But he's actually in the US right now. Earlier this year, he published another book on a very hot topic and one that has become even hotter in recent weeks. It's called King Dollar, The Past and Future of the World's Dominant Currency. Now, this book is informative, insightful, peppered with lots of great stories and anecdotes that looks at the world's most important currency, how it got there, the challenges it has faced and seen off, until now at least, and what might lie next. So welcome, Paul. Very, very glad to have you here.
My pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thanks for that very, very kind introduction.
Now, one of the things I was thinking was that this comes just 5 days after Moody's became the last of the big three to strip the dollar of its AAA. So this is really perfect timing. We hadn't planned that, but I'm kind of glad it happened, just for programming reasons, if nothing else. But before we get to what's happening right now, I'd like to start with some history and some definition, if that's okay. Now, you always hear the dollar referred to as the world's reserve currency. Um, that's how President Trump referred to it in one of his tweets on the subject, and how everyone thinks of it. But the dollar does a lot more than that. It does so many things, which is what kind of accounts for its being the dominant currency. So, what are the different roles that the dollar plays in the global financial system, and how do these interact with each other and reinforce each other, Paul? I mean, you've seen this happen so much.
Yeah, the reserve currency is sort of the common term, which shorthand, and it reflects the fact that the dollar is the currency that's most held by central banks around the world: the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of India. They all hold reserves of foreign currency, and the dollar is the foreign currency that they hold the most of by far. The latest statistics, I think, is 58% of their holdings of foreign currencies are in US dollars. And it's often people who are predicting the downfall of the dollar will cite the fact that it used to be more. It used to be like 70% about 20 years ago or something like that. I think that's a pretty meaningless metric, because the dollar, as you say, I mean, it is used in so many more meaningful ways. Certainly in trade, it's the currency that's used for invoicing exports far more than any other currency. It's and in borrowing, when companies or governments borrow in currencies other than their own currency, they predominantly do so in dollars. And those things do reinforce each other, as you say. I mean, the term of art for economists is complementarity. So, for example, an exporter will want to borrow in dollars, because it has revenue coming in dollars. It wants its obligations coming due to match the currency, to match the currency in which its revenue is coming in. So yeah, these things do reinforce each other.
Great. I did want to mention, I have a list of questions. We'll have a conversation, not necessarily sticking to the list, but also do send in questions on the chat. You can do that, and I'll be selecting from those as well. We want this to be an interactive conversation, and so please send in things. Hopefully, we'll have time at the end, or even sometimes in between, to go into some of those. Now, the earlier chapters of the book show how the dollar got to where it is and what steps were necessary to get there. Now, there's almost a story of a baton being passed from sterling to the dollar, which is how people often think about it. And I think that is correct, but there's also something very interesting happening, in the sense that there seems to be a change in the way the reserve currency or central currency role even works. Because, as you mentioned in the book, the US emerged from the two world wars, the first and the second, and especially the second, as the dominant economy in the world and the biggest creditor in the world. And along the way, you had the end of Bretton Woods in 1971. And shortly thereafter, the dollar went from being the world's largest creditor to becoming a debtor, and now it is the world's largest debtor. So could you walk us through that process, and kind of more conceptually, how should one think of this? Have the rules for being the dominant currency in the world changed? And one of the reasons I was thinking about this was because right after the Moody's downgrade, you got another round of commentary suggesting that things were very precarious. So how should one think about this history, and how what's happening right now fits into that history?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, the U.S. went when it emerged from World War II, and for about until the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, when Nixon took the dollar completely off gold. And then I think it was about 1986 that technically the U.S.'s net liabilities, foreign liabilities, exceeded its net foreign assets, which means this was because the U.S. was running big trade deficits, in the increasingly large trade deficits in the decade or so, 15 years or so before that. So more dollars were going abroad, as Americans bought imports, and some of those dollars were coming back to buy American products. But the U.S. was running deficits, so a lot of those dollars were sitting overseas, being invested in mostly in obligations of the U.S. Treasury bills and bonds and so forth. So foreigners were effectively lending money to the United States. So the U.S. is becoming more and more an international debtor. Well, okay. So the U.S. became a big net debtor, whereas what does that, how much does that matter to dollar dominance? Well, I would, I mean, the U.S. can't go on expanding its, net debtor position, doubling or tripling its, net debts without having some ramifications, serious ramifications. But I would say the more important thing is that the U.S. is, or at least has been up to recently, the biggest, by pretty much any definition you'd like to use, the biggest issuer of safe assets, and and by that I mean that I'm talking about treasury bonds, treasury obligations. The market for those is so big, so deep, and so liquid, and uniquely so. There's no other security in the world that has anything like that, and that's so important in a crisis because in a crisis, anyone who has is holding any large amounts of money wants to make absolutely sure that they can raise cash to cover obligations coming due. They want to be able to sell some assets quickly to be able to raise cash and without not selling at fire sale prices, meaning that they're going to take a big loss. And because the market for treasuries is so big and deep and broad and liquid, people holding hundreds of millions of dollars worth of treasuries can unload them, raise the cash they need without suffering big losses. And that means that this gives dollar assets a big advantage, a unique advantage that over any other security in the world, and in turn gives the U.S. a unique advantage for its currency. So, in that important sense, I don't know that the shift from from creditor to net creditor to net debtor has made a huge difference in dollar dominance.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense, Paul. And one of the things I was thinking about actually is that if you think about the different ways that dollar centrality is expressed or dominance is expressed, some of it is a reserve, most conventionally as reserve asset, but very, very often it's as precisely as that dominant denomination for cross-border liabilities. And that role maybe even expands when the dollar is weaker,
Yeah.
which is something we may have seen, the rise of the eurodollar market in the 1960s and especially the 1970s is a function of a time when the dollar was weak. Similarly, that period between 2002 and 2008. So, you know, this disentangling strength
Yeah.
from centrality seems critical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I've learned from your own writings on this subject how you know mistaken it is to conflate dollar strength in terms of or weakness in terms of the exchange rate of the dollar against other currencies with dollar centrality, with dollar dominance in international commerce. There have been periods of time over the past 55 years or so since currencies began, fluctuating against each other, the dollar has been strong as it is. I would say it is now, although of course in the past few weeks it's weakened a bit, but it's still quite strong against most other currencies by historical standards. And there have been times the ones you mentioned, I mean, in the 70s and in the mid 90s, also the dollar was quite weak. In the first few years of the 21st century. But it's remained dominant throughout all those. It remains the central, the dominant currency in all important forms of international commerce, which is extremely uh, regardless of what's happening to its exchange rate. So yeah, I think those things are, it's yeah, it's kind of annoying that people conflate these things. The conflation is the right way of talking about it.
Yeah. Now, I mean, and there've been periods of, we both know there've been periods of dollar strength and periods of dollar weakness. Now, I referred back to your classics from that, from the period when the dollar was strong. You've written many, but and especially the emerging markets crises of the late 1990s were linked to a period of dollar strength. And um, and you wrote first about the Asian crisis and then the Argentine crisis, each of which resulted in countries being forced off their dollar pegs and contagion that followed from that serious financial distress. And in many instances, we moved to, we reasonably successful floating exchange rates in these countries, but still you hear constant complaints that the centrality of the dollar means that these countries are not in full control of their own financial destinies, because what the dollar is doing matters, what the Fed is doing matters, uh, to how their economies perform. So, and this is what's led to, Lula, for instance, calling for a BRICS currency, the president of Brazil. Um, so, do you think these complaints, primarily from the global South, are A, warranted, and B, will go anywhere? And what can they do about it?
I mean, rather than more than warranted, I guess I would say that it's understandable. Um, I mean, there have been periods when the dollar is weak, and these country and the Brazilians in particular, have complained. There have been times when the dollar is strong, and the Brazilians in particular complain a lot, but other countries. Yeah, and the original complainer, Giscard d'Estaing in the mid '60s, saying the privilege exorbitant.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but countries in the global South do get hit when the dollar goes through its various periods, and perhaps more relevant is that when the Fed is either loosening or tightening, and this causes money to either pour in or rush out of emerging market countries. It's quite understandable that countries feel governments that are affected feel aggrieved about this. And if but I mean, if the U.S. were doing this for sort of what you might call illegitimate purposes. If it was U.S. was like deliberately cheapening its currency to get some kind of competitive advantage, for U.S. manufacturers, that would be. Then you could say, well, the complaints are warranted. But the Federal Reserve has such a tough job trying to manage economic conditions in the United States domestically. Um, I mean, uh, it's they have so many variables that they need to worry about, and now of course it's become even more complicated with tariffs and so forth. Trying to figure out, do we have to worry about inflation? Do we have to worry about more about unemployment? So the Fed has a very tough job, and it would not serve the interests of countries anywhere in the world, I don't think, if the U.S. Had inflation get out of control and then had to tighten, and the Fed had to tighten even more and really tamp things down, as Paul Volcker had to do in the
Yep.
in the early '80s. And it wouldn't serve the interests of countries around the world if the Fed was too preemptively tight, and caused some kind of recession in the U.S., which would dampen demand for global goods. So the Fed has a tough job, and I mean, they do a lot of things to try to uh, avoid, serious financial problems abroad that might affect the United States. It might rebound and for reasons of contagion, come back and hurt the U.S. They have to be concerned about that. But I don't, when foreign governments complain and say the U.S. the Fed in particular ought to try to calibrate its monetary policy and interest rates to avoid causing some form of instability elsewhere. I think, well, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the Fed does do other things, right? I mean, it does it offers swap lines,
absolutely.
not so
Yeah.
many to global South countries per se, but it does to others. What's a swap line? Just so we can explain to people in the audience who don't know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Fed serves, I mean, a central bank serves as a lender of last resort in its own domestic economy. When people are rushing into banks and pulling their money out because of some bank panic, the Fed will, lend cash to banks so to quell the panic. That's one of the most important functions a central bank has. Um, uh, and the Fed, uniquely among central banks, serves as international lender of last resort because during uh, uh, the global financial crisis, 2007, 2009, and there, when everyone was rushing into dollars, it was such a um, uh, kind of confounding, perverse series of events. This was a made in the USA crisis. Americans were guilty of all the malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance, and yet people were rushing into the dollar. Not only, I mean, all over the world, they were rushing into the dollar because they had liabilities coming due in dollars.
Yeah.
They were desperate to get their hands on dollars. So what did the Federal Reserve do? It offered the major foreign central banks first with a group that it was of big industrialized countries, European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Bank of Canada, I guess,
Yeah.
said, well, we will swap dollars for your currencies, whatever the current exchange rate is, we'll just so you have plenty of dollars to give to your banks, to not give, to lend to your banks, so that there won't be a shortage of dollars and no big financial institution will go bankrupt in your economies just for lack of dollars on hand. Um, and then as the crisis got worse, and when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt in September of 2008, the Fed dramatically expanded that to a bunch of other central banks and offered without limit, pretty much without limit, as much as we'll swap our currency for your currency, for some period of time, 3 months, 6 months, and we'll swap back. And after the crisis has passed, when this settles down, when people are not so desperate to get their hands on dollars anymore, and it played a tremendous role. Then again, during in the early stages of the COVID crisis, when there was another financial market crash, the Fed did the same thing. It offered swaps because there was a rush into dollars. There was a shortage of toilet paper, and there was also a shortage of treasury bills. um, and for sort of kind of similar reasons, people were desperate to get both. And so the Fed said, okay, you want dollars? We can print them out of thin air. You other central banks, you can print your currencies out of thin air, but you can't print dollars out of thin air. So we'll swap ours
Yeah.
for yours. We're all friends here, and it's more importantly, it's not just we're friends and we like you and we like to, I don't know, go on vacation in your country or something. We know that if there's a terrible financial crisis in your economy, just simply for lack of dollars, that will hurt the United States. It's not in U.S. interest to withhold this. So yeah, this was a tremendously important function that the Fed serves, swaps. It's little appreciated. Uh, I always get a kick out of seeing how Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, after the global financial crisis, and after the Fed had pretty much, like saved the bacon of French banks, with these swaps. I mean, that was just not just French banks, but he issued a statement saying, I'm going to Washington. This was before a big G20 summit in November of 2008. He said, I'm going to Washington to say that the dollar, which has dominated the international system since 1945, can no longer do this. What was true after World War II cannot be true today. Yeah, well, this was rather ungracious on his part, but okay. I mean, he had a point, which
Right.
was it's not a good thing for the world to be depending on one big power to save the world. That's kind of what is it? It's anxiety provoking,
Yeah.
but yeah, he was wrong. What was true in 1945 has continued to be true
Right.
today. Yeah.
And well, I mean, one of your chapters entitled "Comes Great Responsibility," which I think it's your penultimate chapter, if I remember correctly, and that it gets that point. I mean, I guess one other issue here is that I'm not giving the swap lines also has a mutually assured destruction component because if they don't get the swap lines, they'll sell the U.S. assets they do own, and the rest of the world is enormously long U.S. assets. You don't want a fire sale of those. So there's a very good reason um, to do that. Now, this is uh, one of my theories is that central bankers tend by training, by socialization, um, by virtue of the fact that they have at least two conclaves every year, Jackson Hole and Sintra, where they all gather together. They meet frequently at the BIS, that they're the most internationally minded of all international civil servants,
Yes.
by and large, which then leads to a certain habit of thinking about things in a certain way. Does that sound right to you? You've been around these people for 30 years and longer, so
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the BIS has been performing this function of bringing central bankers together because it's important for them to yeah to know each other and to learn to figure out who can I can I trust these guys? And the answer is almost invariably yes. They feel like they're in a kind of a club of besieged um, public servants who are constantly being beaten up by their parliaments or by their finance ministries, and so they're kind of a brotherhood. Or I shouldn't use the word brotherhood. I know that's politically incorrect, but you get the idea. They mostly are brothers. And so. Yes, and the BIS has been performing this function since uh, almost since its creation. This the great anecdote that really brings us home is that uh, in uh, early 1939. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on his, Montague Norman, the
yeah.
British,
Mhm.
the governor of the Bank of
Right.
England,
Yep.
had become such good friends with I'm going to mispronounce, I'm going to mangle his name, Hjalmar Schacht,
Shaft, yeah.
the head of the Deutsche. I don't know if they called it the I guess they called it the Bundesbank then.
Probably the Reichsbank back then, I was
Hmm?
thinking. The Reichsbank.
Reichsbank. Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, that he went to they had become such good friends despite the obviously growing enmity between their two countries. Norman went to Germany for the christening of Schacht's grandchild, who was named Norman in his honor. So I mean, that's the kind of um, uh, friendships that get fostered, and again, I don't think the Fed does this because it does these swaps or it is a big responsibility, and it's it's not without any risk. So I think they do it because they can make a very strong argument. It's almost irrefutable that this is in U.S. interests. But yeah, it helps. It helps that they know their counterparts and get to know them at gatherings of the kind you mentioned.
One of the questions that come in, and it's something that's been very much recently, Anthony Viscusi asks, what are the benefits and disadvantages does the U.S. economy receive from being the global currency? You already mentioned exorbitant privilege, as Giscard called it. There's now a theory of the extraordinary burden, which is the counterpart to that. We both have some reservations, I think, about the latter characterization. But how would you, how would, where do you fall on the privilege versus burden issue? And first of all, just on the issue itself, burden versus privilege, and then how extraordinary it is in either direction. And I think, where I think we both have somewhat similar thoughts, but
Well, I've learned a lot from you, from your writings about this. I have to, I mean, quite honestly, I'm not saying that just to flatter you. I really have. Um, and yeah, I am a skeptic about the exorbitant burden argument. I mean, I think that, it has some merit at the margin. I mean, but there's, okay, there's like a couple of different formula. I mean, there's several different formulations of it. Uh, but let's just talk. I can think of two that I could sort of competently address. I mean, there's the sort of the most crude version or simplest, I guess, is that is well, because the dollar is a dominant currency, its exchange rate is higher on on foreign exchange markets than it would be, and or it's too high, and that affects the competitiveness of American manufacturers. We import too much, we export too little, and American workers in the heartland are adversely affected. And we talked just a few minutes ago about how fallacious it is to conflate dollar dominance with the exchange rate. There have been periods when it's been weak. There have been periods when it's been strong. So I mean, yeah, is the dollar stronger than it would otherwise be because of dollar dominance? Yeah, but so many factors affect the exchange rate. I mean, the comparative, is the American economy growing faster than other economies is probably one of the most important at any given time. Are interest rates higher or lower? Are they, you know, so many factors affect the exchange rate that I think dollar dominance is, it has some effect at the margin. So the crude version of the exorbitant burden argument, I think it's a real tenuous chain of logic. I mean, it then goes further to say, well, because American manufacturing has been so adversely affected by an excessively high exchange rate owing to dollar dominance. It then goes further to say that this is the main reason why, manufacturing has been so there are so many so many fewer people employed in factories and manufacturing operations in the United States. And again, at the margin, there may have been maybe some small effect that you can trace back to dollar dominance. But anyway, there are so many reasons why manufacturing employment has declined in the U.S. as it has in many other countries, and which are mostly attributable to technological progress, which means that it takes a lot fewer workers to make a unit, a widget, whatever you're making, than it used to, because you can do so in all kinds of more technologically advanced ways. So so then there's the more nuanced formulation of the exorbitant burden that that the U.S. Because the dollar is dominant and foreigners want to hold treasuries, they're lending money at easier at lower interest rates. This makes it more. This enables the U.S. To live higher off the hog. It can live beyond its means and import more and consume more. And so it's an enabler. Well, yeah, at the margin. I mean, I'm inclined. Just look at what's happening in Congress just this past week. Where we're they're uh, enthusiastically, ardently, well, the Republicans anyway, are lining up to pass Trump's uh, promises of tax relief for tips, and what Social Security and all these other, which I think, I mean, whatever. I think these are, ridiculous, sort of, this is ridiculous tax policy, and again, encourages excessive consumption. Um, so, does dollar dominance help enable a little more of the overconsumption in the United States? Yeah, at the margin. And also, conversely, does it enable China in particular to become more reliant on exports in probably in an unhealthy way? At the margin, yes. I think they have many other reasons the Xi Jinping has many other reasons for wanting to do that. Yeah. So there is some uh, there is some merit to the argument. I don't think it's exorbitant, and I don't think I'm very much sympathetic with the view that's been expressed by Ben Bernanke and others that the exorbitant privilege economically is not that exorbitant anymore. It used to be pretty big back in when Valerie Giscard d'Estaing first coined the term. But I'm sympathetic with the view that it's not, if you look at if you compare interest rates, there are plenty of countries that borrow at lower rates than the US. There are plenty of countries that run trade deficits bigger as a percentage of their GDP than the US. So, how exorbitant is this privilege? I'm dubious that there is some advantage and some disadvantage to dollar dominance economically, but I think the foreign policy advantages, being able to
Yeah.
deprive targets of of access to the dollar, that's much more important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, and it's interesting because um, we've had a couple of questions coming about sanctions, and it seems to me that that is absolutely the biggest advantage is not in the economic sphere. In the economic sphere, both the advantages and the disadvantages are exaggerated by proponents on either side. The one other point I would make, and this goes back to the global South question earlier, which is that in a world where countries are scarred by the experience of what happened in 1998, and it even if it's somewhat exaggerated, there is a case for precautionary reserve accumulation, which you can then, um, because if your private sector is borrowing in dollars because it's the most liquid vehicle on the planet, perhaps it makes sense for your central bank to accumulate dollars just to prevent financial crises um, at when the dollar goes up, or interest rates go up, things like that. But the national security part really seems to be where dollar advantage, where dominance is felt more strongly. And interestingly enough, even people within the administration who say they prefer a weaker dollar are very attached to that particular part of that particular offshoot of dollar centrality, which is the ability to surveil transactions and to sanction them. Now, and this occupies another big part of your book, and you talk about how sanctions have kind of expanded dramatically. They were a relatively limited vehicle at one point, targeted mostly at at pariah states. Then they expanded after 9/11, and then have kept expanding. And you have the way you describe it in your book, I think of it almost as the global financial private sector, not just the US financial private sector, being persuaded, drafted, press gang, to use whatever word you
Yeah.
want, into an instrument of American foreign policy. Um, so, I mean, for some people here might not even understand exactly how that works. Primary sanctions, secondary sanctions. How does the U.S. go about imposing those? So, just a very quick, description of that. But then beyond that, there's been a lot of pushback that this is going too far, that this is going to backfire. I made a minor contribution to this right after the BNP sanctions in 2014 when I was at Eurasia Group and we had the weaponization of finance as one of our top risks for 2015. So on that bandwagon of saying this is going too far.
Mm.
Uh, but do you, and you mentioned Dan McDowell's book, in your book. So where are we in that process of things going too far? Um, do you worry about that?
I worry about it for other reasons than worrying that the dollar is going to lose its dominance. So to answer your first question about, this does require a little bit of, for people who are not familiar. I mean, they kind of wonder, well, why should depriving countries of the dollar, access to the dollar system matter to them? Sorry, I'm going to take a sip of water before I go off on my explanation of this. So I think if there's one uh, thing I'm kind of proud of in this book, I think I illuminate the role that CHIPS plays, the clearinghouse interbank payment system. People pay a lot of attention in the media. There's been a lot of attention to SWIFT, this which is a Belgian-based institution which handles, after in February in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were people marching around with signs saying "De-SWIFT Russia," because they were upset about Russia's invasion. I mean, I was upset too. Of course, I think anyone should be upset about that. But Swift is just a messaging system. It handles messaging, which is, it helps the efficiency of international payments, but it's not absolutely essential for it. CHIPS does handle actual it handles transmissions of funds in the sense that this is where big volume dollar transactions across international borders have to go to clear and settle. They have to go through CHIPS, which is in New York and subject to U.S. law. And more important, the banks that transact on CHIPS, there's 40 some really big banks that transact on CHIPS, and they are subject to U.S. law. Now, not all of them are U.S. banks in the sense that, there's Citibank, there's Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, all these familiar U.S. names. There's also a lot of foreign banks that they're some of Brazilian, they're European. My bank, I live in Japan. You mentioned the biggest bank in Japan also transacts on CHIPS, but these are U.S. subsidiaries of those banks, subject to U.S. law. And CHIPS handles about something in excess of 90% of all the big volume transactions in dollars. So because those CHIPS and those banks that transact on it are subject to U.S. law, the U.S. government has the power to designate targets around the world and say, if you transact with that target, you are cut off from access to the CHIPS network. And if you're cut off from access to the CHIPS network, you are, I mean, for a bank operating almost anywhere in the world, that's a kind of an existential threat. It can't handle dollar transactions for its customers, which is very important for doing international commerce. So banks spend lots of money on these huge, big compliance departments. That's where you mentioned they get drafted, press ganged into the role of serving U.S. interests. They spend a lot of money on software so that they can make sure that they're not handling transactions. And then the U.S. has the extra leverage of secondary sanctions. With primary sanctions, the U.S. government, this is OFAC. This is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, this agency in the Treasury Department that's often described as the most powerful government agency no one's ever heard of. And if it designates someone it believes to be to use the technical term, a bad guy, whether it's an individual or a company or whatever, or a bank overseas, you cannot transact with this. This means that all U.S. persons, meaning not just individuals, but any company, that's incorporated in the U.S., banks in the U.S., can't transact with. But with secondary sanctions, the U.S. can go, OFAC can go further and say that U.S. persons are forbidden not only from transacting directly with that target, but with any institution or company or whatever bank or whatever that transacts with the target. And that's whatever the law is anywhere in the world. So the classic example, the really most famous or notorious example of this was when Trump imposed sanctions on Iran, reimposed sanctions on Iran because he wanted in 2018. He didn't like the agreement that the Obama administration had struck with Iran, and he said, I'm reimposing sanctions on Iran, and the European government said, oh well, we think Iran is complying with its obligations to refrain from, to limit its ability to develop nuclear weapons. So we're going to continue to do business with Iran. Our companies say, sorry you disagree. We think that's too bad. And the Trump answer from the Trump administration was basically, oh yeah. Guess what? You're subject to secondary sanctions. If you do business with Iran, we don't care what your law is, we don't care what your policy is. If your companies do business with Iran, they will become targets. And one by one, the big European companies basically caved, which was infuriating for the Europeans because it was like their foreign policy was being dictated to them. They were right to understandably infuriated. So secondary sanctions give the U.S. Really exorbitant power of economic coercion. Does this mean that that the dollar will lose its dominance because alternatives will be found? I'm very skeptical of that. The Europeans tried to set up an alternative channel to transact with the Iranians, and it was a complete flop because it was very clear the European companies were afraid of crossing the U.S. They were afraid that they would become targets if they did. So it didn't work. So I don't. Dan McDowell has a terrific book called "Bucking the Buck," where he writes about the fact that sanctions are giving huge incentives to governments and market players and whatnot all over the world to look for to try to find alternatives for transacting that circumvent the dollar system, but they haven't been successful. They've had. Not that sanctions are a silver bullet. There are ways countries can get around them, but I think the more important reason for the U.S. to be much more, to be really restrained and responsible in the way that it uses sanctions is because they have all kinds of bad effects on the poor, on innocent bystanders, and countries that are targets can retaliate and cause all kinds of other problems, that cause misery. So I'm not suggesting, and I think the U.S. should be, should be complacent and should just feel, oh, well, if we don't like somebody, we just sanction them. No, of course not. But not because I think that we need to worry about dollar dominance. I think, for reasons like I'll stop yammering now about sanctions, but I think that the dollar dominance is here to stay for the foreseeable future. Despite a lot of the things that Trump has done in the past, since January 20th, I think those things could lead to to all kinds of untoward consequences, but not an end to dollar dominance. Yes, they do like dollar dominance for the reason you said. Trump understands that. Yeah, he likes dollar dominance because he used it in his first term to push countries around, and he wants to be able to do that.
In that respect, clearly, you're you're not a doomsayer on that dollar dominance is going to end anytime uh, anytime soon, and that is in part a function of, as you describe, of the frailties of the challengers, and two right now, I think of are the euro, are the euro and the renminbi. So this is as we get close to, it's the last 10 minutes. So one is just a couple of questions here. One is just what do you think of as, very quickly, what are the frailties in question of each of those? But the second one is, part of what I think of as the quid pro quo, if there is one, behind dollar dominance as the U.S. has provided certain public goods that the creditor that the UK provided, for instance. One was free trade, and the other was a was a defense umbrella, effectively. We know the role the Royal Navy played, and so on. Um, if the U.S. pulls back from doing those things, as there's some suggestions that it might like to do, does that how does that affect the prospects for dollar dominance over the somewhat longer term? Does it lead to responses, whether fiscal or potentially fiscal, whether in terms of deepening Eurozone architecture, expanding fiscal common spending, and so on, that changes some of some of these things that might be holding the challengers back?
Yeah, I mean the euro is probably the most credible challenger. I mean, I like Barry Eichengreen's formulation. I think he coined this phrase. We said the euro is a currency with no government, and the renminbi is a currency with too much government. And that really encapsulates their weaknesses as potential challengers, as world reserve currencies or as dominant currencies. The euro, there's what now 27, I think, sovereign governments, each of which issues its own obligations. It has a very professional central bank. It has very sophisticated financial markets in Europe. It has a rule of law. It has a lot of the features that are crucial for a dominant currency, but it doesn't have although German bunds and Dutch government obligations, Finnish government obligations are they're good, safe assets. They're not issued in nearly sufficient quantities as treasuries are, and Greek government bonds and Italian government bonds and Spanish government bonds are not are not. The market for those is different, as we learned from the Euro crisis, most starkly. Might the fact that the U.S. is pulling back from some of its hegemonic responsibilities cause the Europeans to get their act together and become more more well integrated and to the point where they would be issuing safe assets. And of course, Germany is now spending much more than because it got rid of its debt brake in response to Trump's belligerence. So yeah, over the long term, we'll see. I think they have a long way to go. I'm partly for that reason. I'm very, because of lack of alternatives, I'm skeptical that dollar dominance is going away anytime soon. And I forget the second part of your question, but
it was about China, where obviously there are
oh, yeah,
there are these the too much government issue,
yeah.
but they do seem to be some taking some steps in their own way to internationalize the renminbi, primarily through banks, which how far do you think that can go?
Um, well, I mean, if you're talking about the long term, I mean, we can hope that China, uh, opens up its capital market to the point where people will feel comfortable putting their money in 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 assets in the country, holding them there, and they won't have to worry that if a crisis comes that they'll be able to get their money out, and they won't have to worry that in a Chinese court of law that they'll be subject to some kind of the scales will be tilted in favor of parties that have close ties with the Chinese Communist Party. So, which I think is contributes to the reluctance of people to use the renminbi internationally. So yeah, um, uh, over the long term, sure, but the dollar is so entrenched as in terms of its international role now, and the putative contenders have so many shortcomings. I mean, it depends what you mean by certainly in the medium term, there's uh, rather little likelihood that the dollar would be displaced. And if Europe and China move in those directions, the world will be a better place, in my opinion. So why should we be upset about it? Yeah,
That's kind of my view as well.
yeah, yeah,
I think multipolar would probably be better, but
yeah.
they were still talking around poles in terms of countries. There's which leads open the question of crypto and stateless currencies. Let's finish off with that because that's another hot topic and something has come in about that. So, how do you feel about those alternatives?
Ha, well, um, yeah, I think what the part of my book that every author gets, you love reading your own prose. And the part that if I'm looking at my book and I think, yeah, so what part would I kind of enjoy reading over? It's in my first chapter where I explain, what makes a dollar, and because the crypto bros love to say, well, okay, there's nothing backing Bitcoin, but there's nothing backing the dollar either. Nixon took the dollar off gold in 1970, completely off gold in 1971. Any vestiges of the gold standard were terminated at that point. So there's nothing backing the gold. It's backing the dollar. It's a Ponzi scheme too. I try to, I'm perhaps maybe unduly proud, but I really like this section of the book where I explain, no, 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 no. There's so much more behind the dollar in terms of the role that the government
Oh yeah.
plays, laws, regulations, enforcement of contracts, bank regulation, the role played by the central bank, that simply doesn't exist for crypto of any kind. And so, the idea that some even a popular cryptocurrency like Bitcoin could ever replace a dollar is just so ludicrous to me. The idea, that and much less that it could become the international reserve currency. Yeah, I understand that, these people are very idealistic. They're often they're often quite intelligent. I mean, they know much more about the workings of software than I will ever know. But they don't understand the workings of money. And I try to, explain that in a way that I, I hope at least people who haven't fallen down the rabbit hole will find persuasive.
No, absolutely do. And the description of the kind of the unity of money, why you can go and draw money from a bank or write a check. I mean, that really captures this enormous institutional architecture that backs the dollar. I love that part of the book. You're
Thank
absolutely
you.
right. Um, what is your next book going to be about? You have written so many. What's next?
Well, first thing I have to do is write an afterword to the paperback for the paperback edition, because Yale University Press has told me that it'll be due on August 1st, and so much has happened. I mean, it was November 25th, 2024. I remember quite vividly. They told me this. All right, this is it. The book is going to press. We knew who had won the election. But then after January 20th, so many things have happened that have, where Trump has just battered the pillars of dollar dominance, and I need to cover those things. What comes after that, I don't know. I've been, yeah, I don't know. I'm hoping something will come along that will, will will appeal to me. But first I've got to get this. I, I think it's interesting that that my publisher wants a paperback edition out so soon, because it's still, it's a hot topic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And they want it to be up to date. Yeah. As up to
It's
date
hard
as it
staying
can
up
be,
to date
because
from.
Trump is constantly changing this and that and the other thing. So yeah. Yeah.
I have that feeling too. I'm writing something that's been through 3 rewrites, but anyway, already. But thank you so much, Paul.
Well, thank you. Been
Thank
my
you
pleasure.
thank you for joining us. Absolute pleasure. And do check out the book King Dollar: The Past and Future of the World's Dominant Currency by Paul Blustein. And thank you very much for joining us on this
Thank
QI
you.
book talk.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. Yep. Sorry, I filibustered so much that
No, I thought it was.
they can't. We can't be heard now, right? Maybe we can. We got an open mic.
I'm hearing music on the.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay.
Really
Were there a whole
appreciate
bunch
that.
of
I hope it
questions?
was fun for you. I thought it was.
You were yeah, it was. You were keeping an eye on the questions, and there was nothing. I can't do that. I'm too Q&A.
Yeah, I tried to get some of them were already in there, but I thought
Okay.
where I had a question attributed to someone who had asked it. So,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good.
great. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Karthik. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Yeah. Okay.